Okay, let's dive in. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We're here to take a stack of sources, articles, reports, all sorts of notes, and really pull out the essential knowledge, the surprising facts, maybe even find a little bit of humor in there somewhere. The goal is to help you cut through the noise so you can be genuinely well-informed.
Right.
Today we're focusing on one specific day, June 12, 2025. We've got a mix of major global headlines and some, well, pretty intense domestic developments right here in the U.S.
Yeah, looking at the summary you sent over, it's immediately clear this was a packed day. A lot going on.
Right. Our mission is simple. Act as your guides through all this material, figure out what truly matters most from this snapshot in time.
And the summary itself really highlights that complexity. You've got these major global events. The plane crash, Middle East tensions, Israeli politics, right alongside some really contentious stuff happening in the U.S.
Like the immigration protests.
Exactly. Immigration protests, Trump's legal moves, policy actions, the economy, social issues. It's a lot. It really paints a picture of how these global dynamics and domestic struggles are kind of intertwined.
It really does. So, okay, let's jump straight into those global highlights then. Because June 12th had some incredibly impactful news breaking around the world.
Yeah.
And we absolutely have to start with that tragedy near Ahmedabad, India. Just awful news.
Truly shocking. The Air India Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner crash. It happened just 5 minutes after takeoff near Ahmedabad.
Head for London Gatwick, wasn't it?
It's right. And it wasn't a small plane either. 230 passengers, 12 crew members. The latest reports are just horrific. 204 bodies recovered and only one survivor.
One survivor out of all those people. Just unimaginable. And you mentioned this crash is significant for reasons beyond the immediate tragedy, right?
Exactly. This is the key thing, the first recorded accident involving the Boeing 787-8 Dreamliner model.
Wow.
Before June 12th, this plane had a completely perfect safety record. Impeccable.
And the details are chilling. The last communication was a Mayday call at just 625 feet altitude, only a minute after takeoff.
Just 1 minute in.
And you saw the market reaction immediate. Boeing shares dropped over 8% pre-market?
Yeah, more than 8%. Huge hit. And you had analysts saying things like the plane just sank and hit the ground in a ball of fire.
Yeah.
No signs of trouble during the takeoff itself.
So sudden. And the victims came from all over.
Right. 169 from India, 53 from Britain, 7 from Portugal, 1 Canadian. So it instantly became this global incident. We saw reactions pouring in. Britain's King Charles expressing shock. Prime Minister Keir Starmer calling it devastating.
So the speed of the failure on a plane model thought to be flawless, plus the immediate global fallout, it really forces a hard look at aviation safety, doesn't it? Even with the newest tech.
Absolutely. It raises serious questions. Any early thoughts on what might have caused it? The sources mentioned some speculation.
Well, the experts cited are leaning towards either a really critical propulsion system failure, like right after liftoff, or maybe some kind of severe environmental thing.
Yeah.
A large bird strike, perhaps, that immediately compromised the plane.
Gotcha. Both possibilities are terrifyingly quick.
Yeah. For you listening, the nugget here might be how quickly confidence can be shaken, confidence in global travel, confidence in major companies like Boeing, even with supposedly cutting-edge tech.
It really underscores the fragility there, doesn't it, beneath these complex systems we rely on?
Absolutely. Okay, moving from tragedy to, well, escalating tensions, the Middle East was another huge focus on June 12th, specifically around Iran's nuclear program and the ongoing talks.
Yeah, and the U.S. seemed to be taking precautions, making moves.
What kind of moves?
Well, the State Department took a pretty significant step. They ordered the departure of non-essential personnel and their families from U.S. embassies in Baghdad, Bahrain, and Kuwait.
Okay, so clearing out non-essentials.
Right. And Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth also authorized voluntary departures from military dependents in the region. The military personnel themselves are staying put, though.
And the timing of these withdrawals, right before the latest round of nuclear talks with Iran, that feels deliberate.
It certainly seems like more than a coincidence, yeah. A clear signal of heightened concern, perhaps. And it comes just after Iran's defense minister, Emir Aziz Nasserzadeh, made a pretty stark warning the day before.
What did he say?
He basically said, look, if these talks fail, the situation could escalate into a conflict.
Wow.
And the U.S. side, according to these sources, was already feeling less confident about reaching a deal, mainly because Iran is still insisting on enriching uranium.
So the U.S. withdrawals aren't just about personnel safety, maybe. They're also sending a message about how serious things could get if diplomacy breaks down.
That seems to be the read, yes.
Right.
And adding to that tension, the UK Maritime Trade Operations, UKMTO, they put out a warning.
2 ships in the area.
Exactly. Warning mariners about increased military activity in key waterways. The Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman, critical choke points for oil.
Right, that always gets the markets nervous.
Yeah.
And Iran's rhetoric didn't exactly cool down.
Not at all. Nasserzadeh claimed Iran could access all U.S. bases in the region and would target them if provoked. It just shows how tied together Iran's nuclear ambitions, their regional military posture, and, global energy markets really are.
Any spike in tension there, oil prices react.
Immediately. And this all ties into something big happening at the IAEA, the global nuclear watchdog.
Right, the International Atomic Energy Agency. What happened there?
On June 11th, so the day before, the IAEA Board of Governors formally accepted a decision finding Iran in non-compliance with its obligation.
Non-compliance, that sounds serious.
It is. It was backed by the U.S., UK, France, Germany. And it's the first formal non-compliance finding against Iran in, 2 decades. A major step.
How did Iran respond to that?
Their threat was immediate. If that resolution passes, they threaten to expand their nuclear program, maybe even open a new enrichment facility.
That's doubling down.
Pretty much. Interestingly, Russia stepped in with a sort of potential compromise offer, suggesting they could accept Iran's excess enriched uranium stockpile as part of the deal.
Okay. So looking at June 12th, you've got U.S. withdrawals, Iranian threats, this major IAEA action. It feels like diplomacy is fraying, while military readiness ticks up.
That's the dynamic, exactly. It really highlights how the situation is inching closer to, potentially UN sanctions or even broader escalation, diplomatic or military.
So for you listening, the key takeaway is maybe understanding this isn't just technical nuclear stuff. It's directly driving diplomatic brinkmanship, military positioning.
And hitting things like oil prices. The specific actions on this day really show the fuse is getting shorter.
Right. Okay, let's shift focus now to Israel. There was a really specific political test for Prime Minister Netanyahu's government on June 12th.
Yes, a big one. His coalition government faced and actually survived a major challenge, an attempt to dissolve the Knesset, the Israeli parliament.
And the key issue was?
It all centered on a vote about military service exemptions for ultra-Orthodox men, a very contentious issue there. Surprisingly, most of the ultra-Orthodox parties within his coalition voted against dissolving the government.
So they saved the government they're a part of, even though the issue was about them. Was this just like routine politics?
Oh no, this was arguably the most significant internal challenge Netanyahu's government has faced since the October 7th offensive in 2023.
Okay.
By defeating this dissolution bill, they basically blocked the opposition from trying again for 6 months. So it bought the coalition some temporary stability, at least on paper.
But what's the root tension here? Why is this such a big deal?
Well, the core of it is deep anger among those ultra-Orthodox parties. They feel betrayed because a long-promised law exempting their community from mandatory military service, especially during wartime, hasn't been passed.
And this is always a sore spot in Israel, right?
Always. But the ongoing, nearly 2-year war in Gaza, with its heavy casualties, has made the issue incredibly raw. Public resentment from secular and modern Orthodox Israelis, the ones who are serving and dying, is extremely high.
So the opposition was hoping to leverage that public anger, force the ultra-Orthodox party's hand.
That was absolutely their strategy. They hoped the resentment would be so strong that the ultra-Orthodox parties would feel forced to vote against Netanyahu and bring the government down.
But it didn't work out that way.
Nope. Only 2 out of the 18 ultra-Orthodox Knesset members actually supported dissolving the government. Most voted against it after apparently some kind of agreement was reached behind the scenes.
An agreement on a new draft law.
Reportedly, yeah, with the chairman of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. So basically, they got some assurance the issue would be addressed and voted to keep the government afloat.
So it sounds less like a resolution and more like kicking the can down the road.
Yeah. Absolutely. The public anger hasn't gone away. The political fight is just postponed. And the war itself just keeps highlighting and deepening these existing social divides. And the fact that even a leading ultra-Orthodox minister resigned over this whole thing, it just shows how fragile that coalition really is.
Right. And maybe for you, the listener, the insight isn't just the political maneuvering. It's more about how immense pressure, like a long war, can really expose and worsen these deep-seated social divisions.
Yeah.
Forcing these really painful political compromises and highlighting the surprising amount of political clout certain groups hold, even when facing public resentment.
That's a really key takeaway. The political power of the ultra-Orthodox parties here, able to basically threaten the government's stability over this issue, even during a major war. It says a lot about the complex social contract in Israel right now.
Okay, let's move to another major conflict zone, Ukraine and Russia. June 12th saw some notable developments there, both diplomatic and military. President Trump had set a deadline for himself, right?
Yeah, a self-imposed 2-week deadline to assess Putin's willingness to end the war.
And what was his conclusion?
Well, that deadline passed, and Trump's assessment, according to the sources, was pretty blunt. He basically came to believe that Putin doesn't care about the human cost.
Doesn't care. That certainly suggests he sees major challenges in brokering any kind of deal.
It definitely frames it that way. And alongside that assessment, U.S. policy towards Ukraine seems to be shifting.
How so?
Well, Trump hasn't imposed any new sanctions on Moscow, and Defense Secretary Hegseth confirmed plans for a reduction in the military aid budget specifically for Kyiv.
A reduction in aid. What's the administration's reasoning for that?
Their stated rationale is that a negotiated peaceful solution is ultimately in the best interests of Ukraine, Russia, and the United States.
That feels like a departure, though. Some European allies are actually tightening restrictions on Russia, right?
Right.
And even some Republicans were calling for tougher measures.
It is a distinct divergence, yeah. It marks a pretty significant shift in U.S. foreign policy on Ukraine. And it definitely reflects pressure on European allies to shoulder more of the burden. Fits that America First perspective.
Meanwhile, the actual fighting, the reality on the ground remains brutal.
Absolutely. The military situation is still largely described as a stalemate. The human cost remains incredibly high. Russia carried out what was described as its largest nighttime drone bombing of Odessa, recently killed 2, injured 9.
Just awful. Were there any, positive signs at all? Any de-escalation?
Well, the sources do mention some prisoner exchanges. Russia released a second batch of Ukrainian prisoners.
Okay.
And both sides apparently agreed to release wounded soldiers and also prisoners under the age of 25. The total exchange was over 1,000 soldiers. So small glimmers maybe amidst the wider conflict.
Small glimmers. So for you listening, the core insight from June 12th here might be President Trump's personal assessment of Putin combined with the concrete step of reducing U.S. aid. It signals a kind of fragmentation, maybe.
Yeah, fragmentation in the international response seems like a good way to put it.
The U.S. approach is diverging from some allies. And that lack of a completely unified front could, unfortunately, end up prolonging the conflict and the suffering.
That fragmentation is definitely a critical dynamic to watch going forward.
Okay, let's broaden out again. International relations and trade. June 12th has some interesting developments there, too.
Yeah, a notable one was about U.S.-China trade talks. Apparently, officials reached some kind of framework for an agreement after talks in London.
A framework. What does that involve?
According to the sources, it includes things like approving China's exports of rare earth minerals, which are hugely strategic.
Crucial for tech. Yeah.
Totally. And in return, the U.S. would lift certain restrictions on sales of high-tech goods to China.
But this is just a framework, right?
Yeah.
It still needs the okay from Presidents Trump and Xi Jinping.
That's right. It's not a done deal. It apparently builds on a decision back in May to temporarily lower some tariffs, but the full agreement isn't finalized.
And Trump might extend the deadline for talks?
He reportedly indicated he's open to extending the July 8th deadline, which was when higher tariffs were potentially supposed to kick back in if no deal was reached.
So why does this framework matter for you, the listener?
Well, it really matters because this potential deal is like watching a major geopolitical chess match played out through economic policy. China has massive leverage with those rare earth minerals.
Essential for everything from phones to defense systems?
Exactly. And the U.S. is trying to balance getting access to those critical materials with its own concerns about, supply chain security and competing with China in high-tech areas.
So this framework, if it gets approved, could really reshape parts of the global economy.
It absolutely could. It could significantly impact global trade patterns and the ongoing technological competition. It shows these talks aren't just about, soybeans and cars. They're fundamentally about strategic power.
Got it. Anything else on the international relations front?
Yeah, another point that caught my eye was the U.S. apparently reviewing the nuclear submarine treaty that underpins the AUKUS Pact.
AUKUS, that's Australia, UK, US. The security deal from 2021.
That's the one. The review is happening because there's a concern, reportedly, that fulfilling the U.S. commitment, which involves helping Australia get nuclear-powered subs, might actually shrink the size of the U.S.'s own submarine fleet.
Ah, so helping an ally might mean adjusting U.S. capabilities at home. A trade-off.
Exactly. It highlights the complex calculations involved in these major security alliances. Commitments abroad can have real impacts on domestic military resources and priorities.
Interesting. And shifting continents? China's making moves in Africa.
Yeah, the sources note China plans to offer zero tariff market access to 53 African countries. This follows the signing of a new economic partnership agreement.
53 countries. Are there any exceptions?
Just one, apparently, Eswatini. And that's because Eswatini still maintains diplomatic ties with Taiwan, which China considers a renegade province.
Right, so this is a pretty clear play by China to deepen its economic and diplomatic footprint in Africa.
It's a significant effort, yeah. Expanding influence, potentially challenging long-standing Western economic and diplomatic relationships on the continent.
So if you put these pieces together, the U.S.-China framework, the AUKUS review,
Yeah.
China's Africa push, what's the bigger picture from June 12th?
It really illustrates this broader global pivot happening. Countries are maneuvering to secure critical resources, reshape supply chains, solidify strategic partnerships, all part of this era of major power competition.
Makes sense. Okay, beyond those big power dynamics, the sources also touched on other crucial global developments, things that maybe reveal different kinds of pressing issues.
Absolutely. Like, on the Korean Peninsula, a small step towards de-escalation, South Korea decided to stop broadcasting anti-Pyongyang propaganda along the DMZ.
They hadn't done that for years, right?
6 years, yeah. It's seen as a confidence-building measure, reflecting the new South Korean President Lee Jae-myung's desire for more engagement. So, a localized effort, but
Okay.
notable.
And we also got a glimpse from the UN Ocean Conference happening in Nice.
Right. The sources highlighted calls coming from faith communities there, pushing for more focus, more funding for ocean health.
And specific goals.
Yeah, things like a moratorium on deep-sea mining and really pushing countries to meet that target of protecting 30% of ocean biodiversity by 2030.
That 30 by 30 goal.
Exactly. They also noted that the High Seas Treaty, which is crucial for protecting international waters, still needs like 11 more countries to ratify it before it can even enter into force.
So urgency on the crisis, but slow progress on the legal front.
That's the story, yeah. Underscores the challenge of international cooperation on these big environmental issues.
And speaking of biodiversity loss, the situation with African penguins sounds incredibly bleak.
It really does. Critically endangered, and the projection is they could be extinct in the wild by 2035.
2035, that's terrifyingly close.
It is. Conservation efforts are ongoing, battling against things like the fishing industry, even involving legal action. But it's just such an urgent alarm bell about the speed of biodiversity loss happening right now.
We also saw a really stark reminder of immediate climate change impacts closer to home.
Yeah, that wildfire in the Pacific Northwest, the Rowena fire near the Oregon-Washington border. It was already burning 2,500 acres, forcing hundreds of evacuations, closing highways.
And conditions weren't helping.
No, high winds were making it really tough for firefighters. And it comes with the expectation of a hotter, drier summer ahead for that whole region. It's climate change as a clear and present danger right there.
And finally, on the international front, just a heartbreaking human story out of Pakistan.
Yeah, really tragic. A newlywed couple in Faisalabad reportedly died by suicide because they couldn't afford their honeymoon.
Just awful.
It points to such profound issues, lack of accessible mental health services, the stigma around suicide, and just the absolutely devastating impact that financial pressure can have on people's well-being, even at what should be a happy time.
So when you take these stories together, the small peace effort in Korea, the ocean conference, the penguins, the wildfire, this personal tragedy in Pakistan,
Yeah.
they seem disconnected, but maybe they're not.
I think you're right. They remind us that the world's critical issues aren't just about presidents and treaties. They're deeply intertwined with, environmental fragilities, social well-being, economic pressures, basic human resilience.
June 12th just gave us these snapshots.
Snapshots of all these struggles playing out across the globe, linking seemingly disparate events through these common underlying themes of vulnerability and, well, the urgent need for action.
Okay, let's bring it back home now. Dive into the U.S. domestic developments making headlines on June 12th, starting with immigration and those widespread protests.
Right. The situation in Los Angeles was particularly intense. It was the 5th straight day of protests against the recent immigration crackdowns.
And the city responded.
Yeah, Mayor Karen Bass imposed a curfew on the city center. The official reason given was to stop vandalism and looting. The sources mentioned 23 businesses looted, about 200 arrests made before the curfew even started.
And then the federal government got involved.
Heavily. They did. President Trump escalated things significantly by increasing the military presence right there in LA, sent in an additional 2,000 National Guard troops, plus 700 Marines.
Wow. Marines in a U.S. city for protests. That must have caused immediate friction with the state.
Oh, absolutely. Huge conflict. California Governor Gavin Newsom slammed it, called it a deliberate attempt to create disorder and chaos. He even filed a lawsuit to try and stop the deployment.
And the administration's response?
Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth defended it, naturally, said it was about upholding the rule of law and protecting federal agents. It's just such a stark example right there on June 12th of this deep conflict playing out between federal authority and state autonomy, constitutional questions, political clashes.
And these protests weren't just in L.A., were they?
No, they're happening all over the country. Reports mention Boston, Chicago, Denver, New York City, where there were over 80 arrests.
Philadelphia, too, I think.
Philadelphia, San Antonio, Seattle. And Texas Governor Greg Abbott also deployed the Texas National Guard in his state in response.
And amidst all this, the federal government also targeted a specific individual.
Yeah, the Justice Department charged David Huerta, he's the president of the ICIU-USWW union, charged him with obstructing an officer during one of the LA protests.
Targeting a union leader during immigration protests?
Right. And union groups immediately came out expressing support for Huerta.
So, looking at this whole picture from June 12th, the protests, the military deployment, the state-federal clash, the charge against Huerta, what's the key insight here?
Well, it really lays bare the intensity of the ideological fight over immigration, federal enforcement versus state and city policies. You have the administration's narrative using terms like criminal illegal aliens, lawlessness, clashing with reports of peaceful protests, and also concerns about, journalists being targeted, and now a union leader.
It suggests maybe a strategy?
It certainly suggests immigration is being used as a highly divisive issue, and maybe employing tactics that critics would say erode trust or target organized opposition.
Yeah.
That federal-state showdown is a huge piece of it.
Okay, moving on from the protests. President Trump's own legal situation and his policy agenda were also very much in the news on June 12th.
Right. His criminal conviction is still very much alive. An appeal related to that conviction was heard in federal appeals court in Manhattan that day.
The hush money case conviction. What was the appeal about specifically?
His legal team was arguing the case should be moved out of state court and into federal court. Their argument hinges on a claim of presidential immunity.
Presidential immunity. And the Justice Department weighed in.
Yes. And this was maybe surprising to some. The DOJ actually filed an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief, supporting Trump's request to move the case to federal court.
Just to recap, he was convicted on 34 counts related to the Stormy Daniels payment before the 2016 election. Got parole, but the conviction stands.
Correct.
So what do legal experts think about this particular appeal, the venue change based on immunity?
Most experts cited in the sources seem skeptical. They think the appeal, based on how broad their interpretation of the relevant statute is unlikely to actually succeed in getting the case moved.
But the judges seemed intrigued.
Well, one judge on the panel reportedly made a comment about entering a whole new world of presidential immunity, which is a pretty striking phrase.
A whole new world.
Yeah.
So for you, the listener, what does this legal back and forth on June 12th really highlight?
I think it underscores this fundamental, really high-stakes debate about the limits of presidential power and accountability, especially after a president leaves office.
It's bigger than just this one case, then.
Absolutely. The fact that the DOJ is supporting the venue change request and that judges are openly talking about a new world of immunity, it shows this isn't just about Trump's legal troubles. It's an unprecedented challenge that could potentially reshape the presidency itself and its relationship to the law.
Right. Okay. Beyond the courtroom, the president also announced some major policy plans regarding a key federal agency, FEMA.
Yeah, big news there. He announced plans to phase out FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Phase it out completely. When?
After the current hurricane season wraps up. His proposal is to transfer the primary responsibility for disaster relief down to the states.
And the reasoning?
The administration's stated view is that FEMA is poorly managed and expensive.
So how would that even work, phasing out a whole agency?
Well, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem has been tasked with setting up a FEMA review council. Their job is to figure out reforms and manage this proposed transition to state control.
But can the president just eliminate an agency like that?
No, it's crucial to note that completely dissolving a federal agency like FEMA would actually require congressional approval. This is just the administration's plan for now.
Okay. This seems to fit a pattern, though, doesn't it?
It definitely reflects that consistent ideological push from this administration, shifting federal responsibilities down to the state level whenever possible.
The risks seem huge.
Critics are certainly raising alarms, questioning whether states with vastly different resources and capabilities could really handle major catastrophic disasters, huge hurricanes, earthquakes, massive wildfires without that federal coordination and, frankly, funding. It would be a massive shift in how the U.S. manages emergencies.
Gotcha. The president was also busy with executive orders on June 12th related to aviation tech.
Yes, 3 executive orders signed that day. They focus on speeding up domestic drone production, enhancing U.S. airspace security, and trying to reestablish American leadership in supersonic technology.
Drones and supersonic flight, what are the specifics?
Well, the orders include things like allowing drone operations that go beyond line of sight. That's been a big regulatory hurdle. And also launching a pilot program for what they're calling flying cars, basically eVTOL aircraft.
Flying cars, okay. This sounds very much in line with the America First agenda, boosting domestic industry.
It absolutely aligns with that. Heavy emphasis on domestic manufacturing, streamlining regulations in these potentially high-growth, strategically important tech sectors.
And the potential impact.
Well, while they're framed as being about security and efficiency, these kinds of executive actions could have really significant long-term structural effects on federal regulatory power, on the direction of industrial development in these new fields. It's worth watching.
Okay, let's turn to the economy as it looked on June 12th. The White House had a pretty clear message about inflation.
Yeah, their main talking point was that America had beaten inflation under President Trump.
And the data, did it back that up?
Well, the May inflation data did show it easing below expectations again. Core inflation held steady at 2.0% annually, which was the lowest since March 2021. And the White House was quick to highlight that inflation has reportedly come in below economists' forecasts every single month since Trump took office.
So the numbers were heading in the right direction. What about wages?
Wage growth was also described as strong in the sources. Real wages, that's wages adjusted for inflation for manufacturing and non-supervisory workers, saw their biggest jump in nearly a year in May.
And rising consistently.
Reportedly up every month since Trump took office, about 2% over the past year. The projection was the average private sector worker would see about a $1,200 real earnings increase this year.
And specific prices were coming down too.
Yes, that helped the overall inflation number. Energy prices fell 1.0% in May, down 3.5% over the year. Gasoline prices specifically were reported down every month since Trump took office, 2.6% lower in May, 12% over the year.
What else?
Prices also fell in the past month for meat, poultry, eggs, airline tickets, used and new cars, and clothing. So a number of categories saw decreases.
Okay, so the White House is pointing to all that as proof of success, but there was another economic story unfolding at the same time involving tariffs.
Right, a potential counter-narrative. The administration imposed a new 50% tariff on imported steel.
50%. Aimed at protecting U.S. steel producers, presumably.
That's the goal, but it could have a significant ripple effect, specifically potentially raising the cost of canned food by anywhere from 9% to 15%.
Why canned food?
Because the U.S. actually produces very little of the specific kind of tin-coated steel needed for canning, we rely heavily on imports. For that, 75% comes from Europe and Canada.
So hitting those imports with a tariff directly impacts food canning costs.
Exactly. And the estimate is it could put as many as 20,000 U.S. jobs in the food canning industry at risk.
Wow. That's a perfect example of how protecting one industry can hurt another and hit consumers.
It's a classic economic trade-off with potential unintended consequences. And just to add another layer of complexity, a federal appeals court ruled on June 12th that Trump's biggest tariffs, the earlier ones, can actually stay in place while they're being challenged legally.
So the courts are allowing those broader tariffs to continue for now.
Yes, which contrasted with some earlier court decisions that had blocked tariff attempts seen as exceeding presidential authority. So the legal ground is still shifting there, too.
Okay, so with all this swirling around, good inflation numbers, new tariffs, legal fights, how did the markets react on June 12th?
Well, CNBC reported that stock futures fell early in the day. That was largely blamed on the big drop in Boeing stock after the crash in India.
Right.
Wall Street was also keeping a very close eye on those U.S.-China trade talks. The framework was positive news, but it wasn't final yet, still needed presidential approval, so that added some uncertainty.
And the final market numbers for the day? The sources gave specifics.
They did. The S&P 500 and the Nasdaq both finished up about 0.6%. The Dow Jones saw a smaller gain, up 0.3%.
Any big stock movers?
Yeah, Tesla was up 5.7%, Intel gained nearly 8%, but J.M. Smucker, the food company, their stock dropped significantly, almost 16%, likely related to those tariff concerns about canning costs.
Makes sense. What about commodities and other indicators?
WTI oil was down slightly, around $64.75 a barrel. Gold also dipped a bit to $3,345 an ounce. Bitcoin was trading near $109,800. The 10-year Treasury yield was at 4.47%, and the U.S. dollar index ticked up slightly to 99.05.
So putting it all together, the economic picture from June 12th sounds pretty mixed, maybe even contradictory.
It's definitely complex. You've got the White House trumpeting positive data on inflation and wages. But at the same time, you have real concerns about the potential negative impacts of new tariff policies on other industries and consumer prices.
An economy improving by some metrics, but facing new pressures.
Exactly. Pressures from specific policy choices, ongoing legal battles, adding uncertainty. The market numbers really reflect investors trying to sort through that mix of positive signals and potential headwinds on that particular day.
Okay, finally on the domestic front, the sources touched on some important justice and social issues as well.
Yeah, we saw the Justice Department taking direct aim at a state government again, this time suing New York State over its Protect Our Courts Act.
And the DOJ's argument.
They argue the New York law obstructs federal immigration enforcement. Attorney General Pamela Bondi specifically called them unlawful sanctuary city policies.
So this is another front in that federal versus state conflict over immigration we talked about with the LA protests.
Exactly. It signals a clear intensification of the administration's campaign against sanctuary policies, really trying to assert federal dominance in immigration enforcement.
There was also a really striking report about organized crime and its links to border industries.
Yes, a man named Carlos Martinez from Mission, Texas, was sentenced. 11 years in prison, a $2 million fine.
For what exactly?
For leading a violent conspiracy to basically monopolize the transmigrant freight agency TFA industry in the Los Indios border region of Texas.
Monopolized through violence.
Right. He reportedly collected $9.5 million through extortion, using threats, violence, and money laundering. The sources also noted he's the son-in-law of a former leader of the Gulf Cartel.
Wow. That points to a really deep, violent connection between organized crime and seemingly legitimate businesses operating near the border.
It really does. It shows the challenges at the border go way beyond just individual crossings. This case highlights how sophisticated criminal organizations can embed themselves in specific industries, using violence and extortion on a massive scale. Adds another layer to understanding border security issues.
Okay, shifting gears to social issues. The Southern Baptist Convention made some significant declarations on June 12th.
They did. They voted overwhelmingly to uphold their traditional biblical definition of marriage and maintain their ban on same-sex marriage within the denomination.
And they went further than just internal policy.
Yes, they passed a resolution explicitly calling for the Supreme Court to overturn the decade-old precedent that legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. Obergefell v. Hodges.
Calling for the Supreme Court to overturn a major ruling. What else?
They also called for new restrictions on sports betting and generally voiced support for what they termed pro-family policies.
So this suggests a continued, maybe even re-energized push on the social conservative front from a major religious group.
It certainly does. Their willingness to directly challenge a major Supreme Court ruling and stake out clear positions on issues like marriage and gambling, it indicates these remain really significant battlegrounds for them, potential for future legal and political fights.
Right. And lastly, in health and education, just a couple of quick points from the sources.
Yeah, in public health, there was news that over 400 CDC staff who had been laid off back in April were actually being recalled to work.
Being recalled. But didn't the HHS chief just fire some key CDC people?
Exactly. This recall comes just days after HHS Secretary RFK Jr. on June 10th fired several key members of a CDC committee that deals with vaccine policy.
So, recalling staff but removing policy leaders. What might that signal?
Well, it's a bit confusing, but it could signal potentially significant shifts or even turmoil within federal public health policy under this administration. Raises questions about the stability of the public health infrastructure, its ability to respond to future crises if key expertise or structures are being shuffled around like this.
And in higher education financing.
There was a proposal floated by House Republicans concerning student loan debt risk. The core idea is making colleges share in that risk.
How would that work?
Specifically, schools would be required to repay the state for any defaulted federal student loans taken out by their students.
So the college would be on the hook financially if their graduates don't repay.
That's the idea. It could fundamentally reshape how colleges approach financing, admissions, maybe even curriculum, if they have direct financial skin in the game regarding loan defaults, potentially impacting student access, too.
Interesting. And the sources even had a very local example of how national health policy plays out.
Yeah, down in Mississippi, North Mississippi Health Services, their facilities and doctors became out of network for patients with United Healthcare, Medicare Advantage, PPO, and HMO plans as of June 1st.
Why?
Because their agreements were terminated. They're still in network for people with commercial or employee plans through United Healthcare, but not for the Medicare Advantage members.
So these big insurance company negotiations have immediate real-world consequences for patients trying to access care.
Exactly. It's a concrete reminder of how national health policy, insurance company relationships, they directly impact local access, patient costs, especially for potentially vulnerable groups like seniors on Medicare Advantage.
All right, before we wrap up this deep dive into June 12, 2025, the sources had a few quick hits, things they called important bets from the day.
Yeah, just a few other notable items that popped up. Harvey Weinstein, he was convicted of sex crimes for a second time, this time in New York.
This follows his California conviction.
Right, convicted there in 2022. In this New York case, he was found guilty on one count, not guilty on another, and the jury was hung on a third rape charge.
Okay. On a lighter note, culturally.
President Trump apparently attended a performance of the musical Les Miserables at the Kennedy Center.
Les Mis. Okay.
Okay?
Any sports news?
Yeah, some honors for college baseball players down in Mississippi. Ole Miss, Southern Miss, and Mississippi State all had players named All-Americans.
Nice showing for the state.
And Jackson State's football coach, T.C. Taylor, was recognized as the Black College Football Coach of the Year. Plus, William Carey Athletics got ranked in the top 5 nationally in the NAIA.
Good day for Mississippi sports, then. And one final practical note for consumers there.
Right. Starting July 1st, a new state law kicks in requiring all seafood and crawfish sold in Mississippi to be clearly labeled either imported or domestic.
Good to know. So there you have it, June 12th, 2025. Filtered through the lens of your sources.
It was definitely a day that, wow, packed a lot in. High-stakes global events right alongside these deeply divisive domestic developments here in the U.S.
Yeah, the sources really showed that range.
You had the awful plane crash reminding us about the fragility of life and systems, escalating tensions in the Middle East, Ukraine still grinding on, deep internal divisions exposed in Israel over military service, here in the U.S. over immigration, social issues.
Plus all the economic pressures and policy moves.
Exactly. Complex economic signals, major policy shifts proposed, like with FEMA. It was a lot happening simultaneously.
And it feels like, as you said at the start, none of these things exist in a vacuum. They're all kind of connected, aren't they?
They absolutely are. When you take them together, these events paint this picture of really urgent global crises, rapidly shifting geopolitical sands, and these profound domestic policy arguments. They're intertwined in ways that June 12th just made incredibly visible.
So as you, our listener, think about everything we've just unpacked from this single day's reporting, maybe consider this final thought. How does the sheer density of all these critical events crammed into June 12th, from aviation safety and global trade right down to local politics and social resilience, how does that really illustrate the deep interconnectedness of everything, global systems, domestic challenges?
What does that density tell us?
Exactly. What does this snapshot pulled from these sources tell us about the unique pressures of this current moment?
Yeah.
And based on these insights, what specific areas might be the most vulnerable or maybe the most crucial to keep a really close watch on moving forward?